Good morning, everyone. May I interrupt your pastry, coffee, sweetbread? What was out there? I didn't have any of that. Was it? Oh, yeah? Oh, good. Well, was it good? Great. Well, I'm sure you can return during the break or going to your different rooms and pick up a little bit more. But we want to get started, and we want to get started on time this morning. We've got a full day ahead, and I know you're as excited and anxious as all of us are after literally weeks and months of planning for this day. I'm Bill Goodman with Kentucky Humanities, and we want to welcome you to Safe Students, Empowered Educators here at the University of Kentucky. This is an effort that has been long in the planning stages, and we are excited that you've traveled from all corners of the Commonwealth to be with us this morning. It's really an opportunity, as we look at it, for all of us to stay focused and to be focused on looking at and maintaining what we have sort of drilled down on hate, dismantling hate and violence in our school system and with the children that you're with each and every day. So that is our main objective this morning. As I said, that you are from all over the Commonwealth. I know some of you probably know each other, but if you have an opportunity to be in a conference this morning with somebody and you don't know them, take the occasion to introduce yourself. I'm sure you'll hear back and forth during the day some of the things that they're facing and running into, maybe some solutions that you can trade back and forth and help one another throughout the day as we sort of learn together about this new arena that we're all operating in. And of course, conferences like this couldn't happen without sponsors and supporters. We want to thank the University of Kentucky College of Education, the National Endowment for the Humanities and their United We Stand initiative, and Kentucky Humanities, and all the people that have worked hard to put this day together from those entities. We also are deeply indebted to the speakers, the workshop leaders, the advisors that we've had throughout, and we couldn't do it without the volunteers. You have already seen them directing you here and there and where that good coffee is and that sort of thing, so we want to thank them too. If you have any questions today about rooms, where you need to be or at what time, look for a volunteer tag and just ask them, and they'll be glad to support you and tell you what to do as we maneuver through this beautiful facility at the University of Kentucky. So let's get started. We're so glad, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the morning. She's an accomplished teacher, educator, and researcher, and she's done a lot of work in the advocacy of speaking to the area that we're going to be looking at this morning, trying to break the cycle of prejudice and racism that we are faced with too often in our society and in our classes. She's the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Kentucky. She's going to discuss ways to overcome the stereotypes that you may see in your classrooms, which can lead to improved academic achievement and positive development in your students. Please join me this morning in welcoming Dr. Christia Spears Brown.
Good morning, everybody. Let me hopefully do the tech part right here. There we go. That worked well. Okay, well, good morning. Everybody can hear me if I talk about this volume? All right, perfect. Thank you. So welcome to the University of Kentucky. So as a plenary speaker, kind of by definition, my job is to talk for a bit in a way that, quote, inspires and challenges you. That's kind of what they ask in a plenary talk. Well, most of you are overworked and underpaid teachers here on a Saturday, so I'm assuming you neither need to be inspired or challenged, right? I'm assuming by your presence you're both of those. So what I'm going to take on instead is I'm going to aim to both enrage and encourage you. All right? How's that? And I hope to leave you with the encouragement to really keep fighting the good fight. The kids need it, and you're here, so clearly you're part of the cause of this because you came. And so I just want to encourage and remind you that what you are doing is making a really critical impact in the lives of kids. So I'll say, I am the associate dean here, so this is my home turf around this campus, but I'm also a psychologist, and I've studied how kids experience discrimination and stereotypes in schools for 25 years, and written about a lot of these these issues in the U.S. So I can say that I think, having looked at the history of public education in the United States, I think that we are at a real crisis point here. And so I want to talk about 3 trends that are going on at the same time, okay? So 3 trends, the first of which is that we're seeing an increasing amount of gender and ethnic diversity in schools. So the first trend we see, between 1965 and 2016, the number of Latino students, for example, in U.S. public schools increased by 11 million, from 5% of the U.S. population in schools to 26% of the student population. For Asian American students, the numbers have always been much smaller, but they went from about 0.5% to about 6% over the past 50 years. So a lot more diversity. Even here in Fayette County, we see that white students represent under 50% of the population. It's increasingly diverse ethnically. We also see a lot of increase in gender diversity. So now nationwide stats show about 1 in teens would consider themselves to be gender diverse, meaning they don't identify as kind of cisgendered female or cisgendered male, often are gender fluid or trans or non-binary. So we're talking great numbers. So we have to figure out how kids can thrive in a public school system, given that we're talking about more and more kids than ever before. So that's one trend, a lot more diversity across the ways in which humans can be different from one another. The second trend is an increasing amount of biased violence facing kids. Hate and violence, whether verbal or physical, they experience it either directly or they see it on their near constant social media feed that they see all the time. So whether it's George Floyd, the bias facing immigrants that are being detained, anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric from politicians that we see in the public, anti-LGBTQ violence, is at an all-time high. So in 2022, for example, the FBI reported that the highest number of anti-LGBTQ hate crimes reported to date. In fact, anti-LGBTQ hate crimes make up about 21% of all hate crimes. Okay, so we're seeing an increasing number of violence that kids are hearing about, seeing, or experiencing. So you might think, well, that's, a kind of far-off world. It's not in the actual school building. Well, what do we know about hate and violence in schools? Well, the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks this. They're in Alabama. They track hate and bias incidents in the U.S., and they gave 3,000 K through 12 educators a survey about what they had kind of noticed. So what they found was that 2/3 of K through 12 teachers had witnessed hate and bias incidents in their elementary, middle, and high schools in the first few months of 2018. So 2/3 had seen it in their school buildings. So one of the things I'm interested in is, what are they seeing? Well, 1 in 3 were based on race. So black kids being called names, having nooses hung in their lockers at school, the use of the N-word at, quote, near constant levels. Okay. 1 in 4 incidents that these teachers are seeing are anti-LGBTQ. One teacher said, quote, using gay as an insult is done on a daily basis. Students use the F word, which I won't repeat, as if it were no big deal. 1 in 5 of the hate and bias incidents were anti-immigrant, captured by a group of elementary school kids circling one student saying, build the wall, build the wall. Other incidents, anti-Semitic, with teachers reporting swastikas scratched on bathroom tiles, painted in parking lots, written in the yearbooks of Jewish students. Others were anti-Muslim. One 10-year-old Muslim girl found a note in her cubby saying, you're a terrorist, I will kill you. When you have the words hate crime and cubby in the same sentence, you know that we have gone afield, right? And so that might think, oh, well, that's outside. I don't think you are because you're here on a Saturday. But let me bring it closer to home. In our districts in Kentucky, in the data that we've collected as part of my research, we found that 73% of Latino kids in Fayette County have experienced ethnic discrimination, most commonly called names by a peer. We have students that are called a beaner, told to go back across to where they're from. My own daughter, I have a 13-year-old. I was taking her and her friend to an event the other day. Her friend is a Mexican-American immigrant, and she's saying, you know, it's cool now in middle schools to be racist. That's a direct quote from a middle schooler. So it said someone told her last week to go find a hotel room to clean or just go back to Mexico. Here's just a girl that goes to one of our best schools in town. 20% of our kids who are LGBTQ have been physically assaulted, meaning they've been punched, kicked, or injured with a weapon. Half of trans youth have been pushed or shoved. That's in Kentucky, in school districts where we go and talk to kids and see them ourselves. So we see then that hate crimes have more than doubled at schools, K through 12 schools, and that's based on FBI reports, and that means it's bad enough to have gotten to that. So assume that that's a gross underestimation of what's really going on, okay? Schools, and this, I know this finding and it always makes me sad, schools are the third most common location for hate crimes in 2023. Okay, so this is not happening out on city sidewalks all the time. It is in the schools that kids are required to go to as part of their mandatory education, and they are unsafe places. So those are the two of the trends. More and more kids are now getting more and more targeted by hate, violence, especially that stems from bias. So let me pause for a minute before I get to the third trend to talk about two quick kind of sidebars. One, we know that kids don't just show up at school and decide to do these things, right? It's not as though they walk through the school door and then all of a sudden these kind of ideas came. We know that kids are coming to school equipped with these biases, some from parents, but a lot from media and what they see around them in the world. So let me talk for a second about when is all of this kind of developing, just so you're knowing kind of what you're inheriting by the time they get into the building. We know that by infancy, kids are paying attention to gender and race groups. They can sort them into categories before they're even able to talk by methods that they use to test infants and what they look at, for example. By toddlerhood, kids can label their own gender identity. And also by preschool, they are clear on what their gender identity is, which will be a theme that comes up through the day, I think. By preschool, kids are already believing both implicitly and explicitly gender and racial stereotypes. They show preference for people who look like them. By the time they're going to elementary school, their race and gender stereotypes are high. They can label their own ethnicity. Kids of color label it a little bit before white kids do. And they have an ethnic identity that hopefully they feel proud of, because we know that that's an important thing for kids to do well in school. And by the time they're hitting middle school, they believe ideas that girls should be sexualized and boys should be straight and able to get lots of girls. And we have a lot of gendered stereotypes that come with puberty as well. So they have a lot going on individually as they're getting older, as all this other stuff is happening around us, okay? Kids are paying attention to it and are developing biased ideas really pretty much on their own because it makes the world make a little bit more sense for them. So they're often their own worst enemy, but that's partly where this is coming from. The second sidebar I want to make is these experiences with bias and hate and violence, even if it's they're experiencing it indirectly by what they see in the world, we know the consequences are profound for their development. We see psychological health, so lowered self-esteem, depression, anxiety, feeling embarrassed, having negative body image. This is happening when they're hearing comments from others, when they're seeing images of violence. We know it affects their physical health, loss of appetite, nightmares. For LGBTQ kids, extremely high rates of suicide or suicidal thoughts. We also know that seeing discrimination on a regular basis leads similar to PTSD. They have high rates of cortisol. So if you're even seeing images of, for example, the George Floyd and things around Black Lives Matter, some of the violence that focused there, there's research that shows kids that were seeing it in their social media feeds regularly, their cortisol and like their stress hormones are high as if they're experiencing it themselves. And we know that increased cortisol over time, like when you can imagine your own, when you're stressed and that stress hormone is high, if it's high constantly because your group is under threat, we see all sorts of negative health consequences, immune systems, blood sugar. So we see higher rates of diabetes, for example. We see higher rates of early signs of heart disease in younger and younger folks that are the target of a lot of these biased types of groups. And then what's really relevant too for schools is kids are just doing worse in school as well. Right? So often one of the things I talk about with teachers is these issues aren't just about kids' social self-esteem and things like that. It's actually kids are doing worse in school when these things are happening. So the actual goal of school is impaired because of all this social controversies that are happening around them. Okay, so back to my third trend then. So we see the first trend is an increase in diversity among students. The second trend is there's this increase in hate, violence, and discrimination facing kids. And the third trend, though, is that kids are really being used as pawns in the midst of a lot of political debates. So there's greater effort than ever to restrict what teachers are saying in public schools. So, for example, in 2021 and 22, federal, state, and local government officials introduced 563 anti-critical race theory measures in which school teachers are not supposed to talk about racism, for example. Nearly half of them were enacted or adopted. And so here we see Kentucky, where it's been signed into law. My guess is all of you are aware of these. But just to show that this is a nationwide attempt, 563 measures to tell teachers what they cannot talk about in their classroom. At the same time, all that other stuff's going on in the world, teachers are told don't talk about it at all. So it's got a very squashing effect, silencing effect. We also see the headlines about LGBTQ youth and what teachers can and cannot talk about. And so this is, from the Herald Leader. We know that there's constant laws being passed, including in Kentucky, and there's currently ones now. There's ones that have been passed, and there's ones that are currently in committee because our legislative session is currently going, about how teachers can talk about gender identity, sexuality, what bathrooms kids are allowed to use. And one that's currently, an article that was coming out just this past week, a current bill that's being discussed is if a kid seeks mental health counseling, talks to the school counselor about their gender, then they're required to talk to the parents. So that schools are not safe place for kids. And if students feel comfortable enough to talk to their teacher about gender, the teacher is really not allowed to have that conversation back, but needs to report it to the parent, which may not be a safe place. So we know all of this is going on too. all of this to say, the problem with much of this is that we know these headlines, and we also know from research that kids are paying attention and are impacted by it. So another bit of survey, so a survey of 155,000 middle schoolers. They did this survey in 2013. They did the same thing again in 2015, and the same study again in 2017. What happened there was a 2016 election that was particularly contentious and talked about race, and it's where kids learned the phrase build the wall, which we hear lots of kids repeat in our own data. So it's this nice kind of data point. What they found was that they asked kids as part of this study, how often have you been teased or put down because of your race or ethnicity? These again are middle schoolers. This is kids in 2015. So regardless of where they lived, it was about the same amount. By 2017, you saw differences based on the politics of the county. So kids that went towards one candidate, indicated by the red line, experienced more teasing and harassment because of their race than kids that lived in a community populated by the blue line candidate. So all that happened was what kids were hearing on election commercials and conversations around the dinner table, and we see it trickling down into how they're getting treated at school. Similarly, they've done research in the months following the COVID outbreak, which were often referred to as the Chinese virus. And so what the researchers found is that 4 out of 10 Chinese American parents and kids were the target of ethnic discrimination. Among kids themselves at school, 65% heard jokes about their ethnic group. 40% of kids were made fun of for being Chinese. 58% had students making comments about avoiding places with other Chinese people. Again, this is, kids are paying attention to all of this other kind of comments that are being made in the public discourse. The other thing we know, though, that's really critical, and this is the encourage part. Hopefully the enraged part is obvious. This is the encourage part, because what we do know also from research makes a really critical difference. So here's some data from Fayette County as well. So we often hear my research often looks at the bad part. One of the things we did was we gave teachers questionnaires about how much they value diversity in their classroom. The idea of how much do you think having a classroom of diverse kids makes it more interesting and enriched, and we all have something different to bring, and that makes it a better space. The teachers that believed that, the kids, someone help you interpret this graph here. This is how much discrimination kids are facing at school by their teachers and by their peers, the other kids in their class. This is how much the teacher values diversity. What this shows is that the teachers who value diversity, when you ask their kids separately and privately, how much discrimination are you facing? The kids whose teachers thought diversity is a good thing, they actually experience less discrimination by other kids in the class and by other teachers. The teachers who thought diversity just makes it more complicated, it's an extra hurdle I have to overcome, it would be a lot easier if we were just a little bit more similar, those kids had a more discriminatory classroom experience even by the other kids. So it's this idea that teachers, your values in implicit and explicit ways are shaping how kids are treating each other in the classroom. And these are Latino kids who are the ones that were being called names. The teachers' attitudes seem to be shaping what's allowed in the classroom, even in ways that teachers may not be aware of. It's not explicit. It's just your values are seeping in really good ways for shaping the culture. We've also done studies where we've gone and looked in the classrooms and in the hallways at what kinds of posters, what kind of decorations are done. One of the reasons I like this research is this is a low-cost, low-impact study, right? This is a matter of what you go buy at the teacher store, at the parent-teacher store. We've looked at the classrooms that just have these kind of folks up there, and we've compared it to classrooms and hallways that have these kind of signs up there. What we find is kids who have, and we send our research assistants out and they look for these kind of signs and we record it. And then we go and interview the kids about their experiences. The kids can't ever point to this. And they don't say, because there's that diversity poster, I feel good about myself. Nobody that knows, a third grader knows that's not how it works. But what we do find is when kids go to these kind of schools, regardless of who's in the school building, regardless of the ethnic composition of the school, these kids feel better about their ethnicity. Their ethnic identity is more positive. And that's a really big buffer for all of this other negative stuff that's happening. So even when they experience discrimination, they feel better about themselves, and you don't see the negative impacts later. That's like low-hanging fruit right there. It's just saying, we respect you, and these aren't the only people that contribute and are important to our world. And I'll say, we just went on I'll do this little plug. My kid is going to start Frederick Douglass High School in the fall. And so I was just there on Monday for the little freshman orientation thing. Y'all have a lovely poster in the hallway that says, basically, diversity matters, everyone matters. I took a picture of it as a great example. Did y'all do that one? Yay. That stuff really matters. Shout out Frederick Douglass. Because I think about this stuff, it's lovely. It tells kids implicitly, this is what we value, and we value you. And even if you're a white kid, a cisgendered straight white kid, this says everybody here matters, and this sets the tone. And we know that kids pay attention to that. We've got lots of other studies about this too, experimentally, so good job. We also know that from other studies is that representation really matters. And so despite the fact that politicians are debating what kind of pronouns we can use and what kind of bathrooms kids are able to use and whether you have to tell parents if your student asks for a different pronoun, using chosen pronouns and names of trans youth reduces their chance of suicide by 70%. 70%. The number one source of discrimination for trans youth is peers and often parents. So that means it's on you all. This is life-saving kinds of efforts. Politicians are not considering this. This to me is also an easy 70% it saves the risk of suicide. Kids, trans youth, suicide or attempted 50% of kids do. This is an easy way to protect lives. So what you're doing matters in profound, deep ways. We also know, again, it's not what politicians are wanting us to do with our bills. However, there are studies that show, studies published in the top developmental psychology journals on consequences of learning about historical racism. They've even looked at doing it with white kids and black kids. Maybe it's so traumatizing to black kids or white kids we should never talk about racism. Guess what? It's not. Their racial attitudes were better after these conversations. Okay? So there is research that shows that these conversations in schools actually help kids be more tolerant and inclusive and reduces the biases that they're facing later. Okay? So it's counter to what some of the laws are saying right now, but just so you know, this is what we've known from science and have shown really consistently. Okay, so I'll say, here's my little shameless plug of this if you want to do a deeper dive in all of this, about all of the things. But what I'll say with my take-home message, and then we can have time for conversation, is the take-home from things is that we know kids are experiencing hate and bias. We know that they're coming to school before they ever even walk in the kindergarten doors with the prejudices of society. And not as much from just parents as we often think. They're overhearing the snippets everywhere. Kids, as y'all probably know, is what I say is kids are both brilliant and moronic at the same time. Right? They do things that are brilliant, and you're like, oh man, but you're such a moron right now. I say that with love as a parent and a psychologist. They pick up and they're really smart, but then they're also not able to put it together in a way that's always cohesive and logical and in their best interest sometimes. They're sometimes their own worst enemy. And so they're paying attention and affected by the culture wars that we're currently in and the legal battles and the ideological disputes that politicians are having. They are affected by it because it filters into the classroom. But what you're doing matters. It may be how closely you're watching the peer interactions. It may be how you decorate your rooms and implicitly convey those values. It's how you talk about who's important and who takes up space and how each person gets respected in that space. And we know that what you're doing then predicts not only their academic life, which is important, but also their psychological, their social, their physical, and their mental health. So, no small feat, not to put the world's problems on you, but you already carry that. So, before we go into questions, again, just be enraged by it all. I'm enraged by the laws that pass, simply because, and it's not a political statement, it's just not in kids' best interest. So partly what we have to do, and hopefully what you'll get from this day, is how can we do what's best for kids in the space that we need them to be and hold that as our North Star, even while this other stuff is playing out in the news. Okay. So now let's have some questions or conversation, comments.
Great. Everybody, if you'll raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you. So Kathleen's on that side. I'll stay on this side. Get our attention if you need to, okay?
Hi, good morning. So I think we've got the rage part down. And we live in a commonwealth where harming children is a legislative priority. So what's the hopeful part? How do we respond from the political side? And I see there may be some sessions later today that kind of hit on that too.
Well, I think there's two ways to respond. There's the overt contacting legislature part. There's the rallying together and making collective voices known. And there's also ways in which we figure out, in which ways we've always figured out how to be subversive, right? So I think sometimes it's the subversive ways in which you know what's best for kids and you have relationships with kids, and how can we figure out how to support that person in that space in ways that navigate the narrow-mindedness of some of the laws. And that I believe that educators, what's frustrating is, these laws have never consulted educators, and I don't think actually capture what goes on in a class, right? No educator says, I'm going to teach critical race theory in class today. That's not what happens. And so I think part of it is that so part of it is knowing really clearly what the laws say we can and cannot say, and then following the letter, but not the spirit of it. And so how can we be creative in helping kids be their best selves? And there's actually a lot of wiggle room, partly because these laws don't capture what a classroom is actually like. And so what you can say. So part of it is just knowing the world has changed by committed individuals being both subversive and then also rallying together and applying pressure. So I think it's that dual approach. And knowing that, teaching is, as they say, it's much more relational than informational. And so it's building those relationships so that you are the trusted person in the kids' lives. And knowing that you may be the only trusted person in life. And that a politician cannot take away.
We have another question right here.
Do you see more similarities or differences between rural and urban realities in terms of, addressing these issues?
I think it's a lot easier to be a trans kid in Fayette County than I do in Pike County, you know? I think that there are differences. Sometimes though, it is idiosyncratic. There are sometimes you have schools that are fantastic and progressive and inclusive that you wouldn't expect based on the demographics of where it's located. I find the biggest difference is in principals. You know, I've been in, you know, every single school in Fayette County, for example, the second largest city in the state. And I've been in schools where you walk in and you're like, wow, every kid, I'll do another positive shout out, Dover, for example, elementary, is another positive shout out of you walk in there and you're like, this place has been shown to be an inclusive space for people. You go into other places and you're like, wow, it looks like they think only white, straight, cis men exist. And that's all within the same school district. I do think, though, folks in more rural areas have a harder challenge because our data, you know, data nationwide and others shows, and I didn't go into a deep thing because, you know, voting patterns in communities is really predictive of the experiences of kids in those communities. And we know the voting patterns differ among rural and urban counties in the state and nationwide. I think the politics matters. And it affects, because I think it affects not necessarily the individual teachers, but what teachers are scared of doing because of parent backlash.
Okay, we have another question right here.
So based on the same like voting idea, do you see a larger relation or trend between local voting patterns or national voting patterns? Because I know a lot of communities in Kentucky locally might vote a little more Democrat, but nationally have always voted more Republican.
I think that issue has changed over the past, I think things really changed about 10 years ago. And I think it's partly because the media is so disaggregated now that now national voting becomes so prominent even for kids, and it's so extreme in being like anti-immigrant, frankly anti-black, anti-LGBTQ, I mean really overtly so, that even the national patterns seem to be important. The local level, like in terms of who vote for at the local level, like the mayor or like the school board matters a lot, but like the local part seems to be less important than who they're voting for at the national level, because that seems to be more about kind of the culture there, right? And again, lately, over the past decade, in a way that you haven't seen since around the 60s, politics has been linked to these identity groups in ways that we've not seen for a while. And so kids are paying attention to these identity groups because kids are learning their identity. So it happens to be that what's discussed in the politics now is issues that kids are thinking about, right? So it's not as though there's big national debates on the tax code, or like, we're not even really talking much about like healthcare and those kind of things. It's really identity-based politics in terms of immigration, anti-trans stuff. And those are the topics that kids are already thinking about, because kids are learning their identity. That's why in preschool, kids are learning that stuff. So the stuff happens to be landing on the things that do impact kids. And I think that's where the challenge is. And that's what all kids are seeing. That's not just about who are you voting for the local judge.
Any other questions?
I've just found lately in talking with kids that they know the ideas of racism and prejudice and discrimination, but when we start looking at very specific events in history or start talking about specific things happening now, that it sort of changes their perception in ways that I am surprised by. So I feel like I'm wondering, has there been study done based on not just like the ideas that they hear around, but when they're really talking about specific events in history that maybe they've never heard before, or conversations that are happening now about very specific details now? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the historical part, they often struggle to realize how it might impact things now, right? So often when kids do talk about racism, for example, in schools, it's in the month of February. It is, and it's often the context has been, well, Martin Luther King fixed it all, and so now we're good. And so then there's the disconnect between, well, what's all this like riots about now, or what's going on now? And then it can feel really scary because it can feel violent. And when you see it on your phone, for a kid, it's hard to know, is this violence happening in Michigan or, Minnesota? Or is it happening down on Main Street, down the street, or in the parking lot of my school? Right? It's hard to know because the media is so integrated into our lives now. It's not like when I was a kid and you watched it on NBC Nightly News and that was how you got your news. This is like all the time in their face. So I think it can also be overly scary. Not overly, it can be scary, and that then makes it hard to process what it means too. So I think it is hard when you're talking about the specifics, and each one's a little different. One is, how do those connect? And that's where I think the law is wanting us not to talk about how things like slavery have had a modern day implications, which of course they do. But we're not allowed to talk about that. But kids have a hard time seeing it, and then they have a hard time understanding what's going on now in the current events because they're not able to necessarily see without help the bigger picture. And I think they do need help figuring out how it all works together and what it means in their small world. I don't know if that answered it, but yeah. Okay.
Christia, we got another question up here, please.
Hi. I have a question about Black history and overall United States history. Why is it starting to be erased out of our history books, especially in elementary schools? It's a major part of our history that elementary school kids need to know. And when you get to Black History Month, a lot of people are like, what is it all about? Is it about some different country? Is it about what's supposed to be in our history books? Why is it disappearing every year?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, I would say it's not now disappearing. I'd say it's never been there. We're just now really aware that it's not there. But it is, to your point though, I mean, I have a colleague that studies kind of what I do in the state of Florida, and her husband works for a textbook company. And the textbook company had to pull their social studies textbook because their middle school social studies textbook used the word slavery 3 times. And so that is exactly your point, that even that's been taken out. Why? I think it's this. I think that we see traditionally, historically, whenever you see demographic shifts and distributions of power, the groups that have traditionally held that power try to exert a lot of control. And you do see a shift when in the presidential election of Barack Obama, you saw a big backlash about race. And the people that had traditionally controlled the complete narrative seemed to have felt threatened and then have to exert that pressure by getting rid of all potential indications of black people. So there's a lot of research that looks at the election of Barack Obama actually had a really counterintuitive effect in terms of it wasn't the end of racism, it actually led to a resurgence of racism.
I think we have time for one more question, and there's one right down that aisle.
Oh, yay. Good morning. So now that Kentucky has pretty much systematically erased Black history with the law, erasing teachers and educators' abilities to teach racism, slavery, and past indiscretions, what can we do now to make sure that we are not stepping across that line, but still making sure our students know what happened in the history? There has to be something we can do.
I mean, there has to be something you can do. When we find the magic bullet, we'll all share it each other on a group text.
Amen.
I think that's the challenge. I mean, that's really the challenge. I think that it can still be embedded in everything we talk about, because Black history is American history and American history is Black history, right? That it has to be an integrated part. I think, frankly, the way we've done it historically, where we teach it in the month of February, and all of a sudden the month of February, like, oh, Black people existed in American history. I think that has allowed it to be chopped off a little bit easier, as opposed to saying everything. How do we talk about how everybody was present at every part of history? And so sometimes I think the easiest way to overcome some of these oppressive bills and laws is to actually lean into it more. And that if you lean into it in every part of the conversation, it then becomes not this separate thing you chop off. It's when you're talking about it at the kind of founding of America. You're talking about it in, the 1700s and the 1800s, and it's not just, oh yeah, here's slavery. It's really all throughout. It's always thinking about when I show images of who was doing X, Y, or Z, make sure the faces are diverse in it. So showing that everyone existed at every point in time, and everybody contributed in different ways. Some people were oppressed and were forced to do certain things, but everyone made a contribution, and if we talk about it, I think, in that way, it becomes not this thing you can lop off. It becomes an integrated part. So I think in some ways integrating it more makes it harder to be this thing that we then ban. And I think the same thing for gender. So, right, like the same thing happens for gender. Gender identity exists from the time kids can say what their gender is. Kids know gender identity. The laws that say you can't talk about gender identity. If you say, okay, the girls, let's go here. I just talked about gender identity. When I said, okay, she's going this way, I just used pronouns. We were always doing it. If we all, books in the classroom, those can be very diverse, and that's showing I value it even if I'm not having a lesson on it. It is integrated in everything that I'm doing, because we are all of that. We are diverse, and we are all part of our history. So I almost think it's like that counterintuitive answer is kind of doing it more, but doing it all throughout.
Thank you so much, Christia. So this is the end of the first session. You'll note.
Let's give her a round of applause. That was awesome.